They were supposed to be spending their last years in peace. Instead, after their own children turned them out with little more than a few blankets, an elderly couple vanished into the hills with nowhere left to go. For 2 days, they wandered through cold stone and wind until they found a narrow crack in the side of a mountain, just wide enough to crawl through. 50 feet in, with their hands raw and their lantern nearly spent, they entered a hidden chamber no one had touched in 80 years. What they found inside was not just shelter from the cold, but a secret so perfectly preserved it would change everything they thought they had lost. But let me start from the beginning. Let me tell you how Harold and June Whitfield ended up crawling into a mountain on a Tuesday night in October, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and 2 wool blankets their own son had handed them like severance pay. Harold was 76. He'd been a carpenter for 41 years, built porches and cabinets and bookshelves across 3 counties in West Virginia. His right knee had gone bad after a scaffolding fall back in 2008, and his hands were thick with calluses that would never soften. He kept his father's brass-folding ruler in his shirt pocket every single day. It was the one thing he never let anyone touch. June was 74. She'd taught 3rd grade for 32 years before retiring. She could tell within a week which students had someone reading to them at home and which ones were raising themselves. She carried a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, tiny penciled notes next to certain verses. It was the only piece of her mother she had left. They'd been married 53 years, lived in the same house for 42 of them, raised 2 children in that house, buried their dog under the oak tree in the backyard. The house wasn't fancy. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a front porch Harold rebuilt twice. But it was paid off. It was theirs, and it was home. Their son Bradford was 48. He sold commercial real estate in Charlotte, drove a leased SUV he couldn't quite afford, and wore suits that cost more than Harold's monthly pension check. Their daughter Linda was 45, a marketing director in Raleigh. Married, 2 kids she talked about more than she saw. The trouble started in the spring, when Bradford drove up unannounced on a Saturday morning. "We need to talk about the house," he said, sitting at the kitchen table where he'd eaten breakfast every morning for 18 years. June poured him coffee. Harold sat across from him and waited. "The roof needs replacing," Bradford said. "The furnace is 20 years old. The porch is sagging again. You're looking at $40,000–50,000 in repairs, minimum." "I can fix the porch," Harold said. "Dad, you're 76. "I'm aware." Bradford leaned forward. "Linda and I have been talking. The market's strong right now. If we list the house, we could get $240, maybe $250. That's enough to set you both up in an assisted living place. A good one. You'd have meals cooked for you, medical staff on site, activities." June set the coffee pot down on the counter. "You want to sell our house?" "I want to take care of you," Bradford said. "Both of you." Harold looked at his son. Bradford had June's eyes, but none of her patience. He'd left Cedar Hollow at 18 and visited less every year. Christmas became a phone call. Birthdays became a text. Now he sat at their kitchen table talking about the market being strong. "We're not leaving," Harold said. Bradford came back 3 more times that summer. Each visit he brought new numbers, new brochures for retirement communities, new reasons the house was a liability. Linda called twice to back him up. She didn't come in person. In August, Bradford showed up with a man Harold had never seen, a real estate agent, already measuring rooms and taking photographs before anyone asked him to. "What is this?" Harold said from the doorway. "Dad, just hear me out. Get him out of my house." The agent left. Bradford didn't. They argued for 2 hours, which was about an hour and 50 minutes longer than Harold had ever argued with anyone in his life. June sat in the living room with her hands folded in her lap, listening to her son explain in careful, reasonable language why his parents couldn't take care of themselves. In September, Bradford called with the news. He'd consulted a lawyer, because Harold and June had added Bradford's name to the deed years ago, back when they trusted him to handle things if something happened to them. He'd had legal authority to initiate a sale. He'd found a buyer. Closing was in 3 weeks. June didn't speak for 2 days after that call. Harold drove to the county courthouse and sat with a clerk who confirmed what he already feared. The deed was joint. Bradford could force the sale. Harold could fight it in court, but he'd need a lawyer he couldn't afford, and the case would take months he might not have. The house sold on October 3rd for $238,000. Harold and June were given 30 days to vacate. Bradford said he'd put their share in a trust, that they could access it once they were settled in a facility. What if we don't want a facility? June asked on the phone. Mom, it's not really up for discussion at this point, Bradford said. Harold stood in the kitchen listening and felt something go quiet inside him. His son was talking to them the way Harold had once talked to the dog when he tried to climb on the furniture. Firm. Final. The voice you use on someone who doesn't get a say. They packed 42 years into boxes. Most of it went to a storage unit Bradford had arranged. June kept her Bible, one change of clothes, a photograph of her and Harold on their wedding day. Harold kept his father's ruler, his work boots, a flannel jacket, and the pocket knife he'd carried since he was 14. On the last morning, Harold stood in the empty living room. The walls still showed the shadows where picture frames had hung for decades. Faint nail holes marked every spot. His hands itched to patch them, sand them smooth, repaint. That's what a carpenter does. He fixes what's broken. This wasn't something he could fix. Bradford met them at the front door with 2 wool blankets and a printed sheet of paper. The paper had the address and phone number of a shelter in Elkins, about 40 minutes north. It's temporary, Bradford said. Just until we get the trust sorted. A couple of weeks, maybe a month. Harold looked at the blankets. Then he looked at his son, 48 years old, standing in the doorway of the house Harold had carried him through as a newborn, handing his parents blankets and a phone number. "Where's your sister?" Harold asked. "Linda couldn't make it. She sends her love." Harold took the blankets. He didn't take the paper. "Dad, the shelter is a good option. Goodbye, Bradford." They walked. June held Harold's arm, and they walked down the street past houses where they'd been neighbors for 4 decades. A woman watched from her window across the road but didn't come outside. Harold didn't blame her. What would she say? They didn't go to the shelter. Harold had spent 41 years building things with his hands. He wasn't going to spend his last years in a room with a number on the door, eating meals on a schedule someone else set, waiting for a son who would never visit. They walked east, toward the hills. The first night they slept under a highway overpass about 6 miles outside town. Harold folded one blanket beneath them and pulled the other over their shoulders. October in the West Virginia mountains meant temperatures in the low 40s at night. June pressed against him and shook. "We'll find something," Harold said. June didn't answer. She held her Bible against her chest and stared into the dark. The cold didn't scare Harold. What scared him was the look on her face, the one that said she'd stopped expecting anything from anyone. The second day was worse. June's right hip had been grinding since the morning they left, and by afternoon she was limping badly. Harold's knee locked twice on the steep ground. They split the last heel of bread and passed a half-empty water bottle between them. They passed 2 farmhouses. Harold thought about knocking, asking for food or a place to sit down. But the shame of it pressed on his chest. He'd worked every day of his adult life. He'd never asked anyone for a thing. By late afternoon, they were deep in hill country, following a ridge neither of them recognized. The wind picked up. Clouds stacked thick and low. The temperature was falling. Harold. June stopped walking. Her face was gray. "I can't go much further." "Just a bit more. There's got to be something." And there was. A dark line in the rock face, half hidden behind a tangle of dead rhododendron. Harold pushed the branches aside and found a narrow opening in the limestone, a crack about 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall. He held his keychain flashlight up to the gap. The beam disappeared into black, but the air coming from inside the rock was warmer than the wind at their backs. "Stay here," he told June. He squeezed through sideways. The passage was tight. Scraping his jacket on both sides, he dropped to his hands and knees and crawled. Flashlight clenched between his teeth. The rock was smooth, worn by water that hadn't flowed here in a long time. 10 feet in. 20. 30. The walls scraped his shoulders. His knee screamed on the cold stone. At about 50 feet, the passage opened up. Harold stood slowly, his joints cracking, and swept the flashlight beam across the space. A room. Not natural, or not entirely. The walls had been widened by hand, the floor leveled with packed earth and flat stones. Maybe 30 feet across, with a low dome of pale limestone overhead. Along one wall, wooden shelves held rows of sealed mason jars, their contents dark and still behind the glass. Against the far wall sat a crude stone hearth, its chimney disappearing into a natural crack in the ceiling. On a ledge carved into the rock, 3 quilts were folded in careful squares, their colors faded but the fabric holding together. Nobody had set foot in this room in decades. A thin film of dust covered everything, smooth and undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks, just stillness. Harold went back for June. Getting her through the passage took 20 minutes. Her hips seized with every movement, and twice she stopped to press her forehead against the cold rock and breathe through her teeth. Harold held her hand and talked her through it the way he'd talked her through labor with Bradford, steady and calm and right there with her. When June finally stood in the chamber and Harold held the flashlight so she could see, she covered her mouth with one hand and didn't move for a long time. "Harold," she whispered, "someone lived here, a long time ago." She walked to the shelves, letting her fingers hover over the mason jars without touching them. She looked at the hearth, the quilts, the flat stones someone had laid into the floor with real care. Whoever they were, she said they knew what it meant to need a place. Harold found an oil lamp on a wooden table near the center of the room. The table was hand-built dovetailed joints, the kind of work that spoke of patience and skill. He recognized it immediately. Whoever had made this table was a craftsman. The lamp's wick was dry and brittle, but a tin of matches sat on the shelf beside it, sealed in wax paper. Harold peeled the paper away, struck a match. It caught on the first try. The lamp filled the chamber with warm amber light. Shadows moved across the limestone walls. The room looked almost alive, like it had been holding its breath for 80 years and finally exhaled. Harold set the lamp on the table and pulled June close. She was still trembling, but not from cold anymore. They spread one blanket on the stone ledge and sat together, their backs against the wall, watching the lamplight dance. For the first time in 2 days, the wind couldn't reach them. The air was cool and steady, without the edge that had been cutting through their clothes since they'd left home. June looked at the shelves again. Among the jars and folded tools and cloth, something caught her eye on the second shelf, pushed back against the stone. She stood and reached for it. A book. Leather-bound, thick, its cover cracked but holding. She tilted it toward the lamp and read the words stamped into the leather in faded gold. Ada Crane, 1944. June's hands went still. Her maiden name was Crane. Her mother's name had been Mary Crane, born somewhere in these mountains. Mary had left West Virginia at 18 and spent the rest of her life refusing to answer questions about her childhood. "Where did you grow up, Mama? What were your parents like?" Mary would change the subject every time, steer the conversation somewhere safe. She took whatever she knew about these hills to her grave. June opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was small and careful. The ink faded to the color of rust. October the 14th, 1944. June read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Today we moved the last of the supplies into the cave. Elias finished the hearth. The children are scared but warm. The Ridley Mining Company took our land, but they cannot take this mountain. Not this part of it. Not as long as someone knows it's here." Harold watched June's face in the lamplight. Her eyes moved across the old handwriting, and something shifted in her expression. Not hope. Not yet. But the beginning of recognition, like she was reading a letter addressed to her from someone she'd never met but had been waiting her whole life to hear from. She turned the page. The second entry was dated 2 days later, October the 16th. 3 more families arrived last night. The Harpers and the Bowmans lost their homes on Tuesday. The Webbs came with their 2 girls and nothing but the clothes on their backs. Elias carried the youngest through the passage on his shoulders. She was 4. She didn't cry once. June read aloud and Harold listened, sitting across from her at the old table with the lamp between them. Ada Crane's voice came through the faded ink, clear and practical, a woman describing a crisis the way you describe a recipe. "Here is what happened. Here is what we did about it." The journal told the story in pieces. The Ridley Mining Company had moved into the valley in the spring of 1943, buying up land for coal extraction. Most families sold willingly. Some held out. By the fall of 1944, the company had started using legal pressure, threatening eminent domain, filing liens, sending men with official-looking papers to doors where women were home alone with children. Families who refused to sell found their wells poisoned or their fences torn down in the night. Ada and her husband Elias had owned 40 acres on the mountain's east slope. Their family had been on that land since before the Civil War. When the mining company came, Ada told them no. "Elias says I'm stubborn," she wrote. "I told him stubborn is just another word for standing still when everyone else runs. They'd lost the land anyway. The company filed papers Ada couldn't read and hired a lawyer she couldn't afford. By September of '44, the Cranes had a week to leave. But Ada didn't leave. She'd found the cave 2 summers earlier while picking blackberries on the upper ridge. A narrow crack in the limestone, barely visible unless you knew where to look. She'd crawled in out of curiosity and discovered the natural chamber inside, a space carved by water over centuries, dry and cool and hidden. She told Elias. Together, they spent 3 months preparing it. Elias was a miner and a builder. He widened the passage, smoothed the floor, constructed the hearth using stones he carried in on his back, one at a time. He built the shelves, the table, the ledge for sleeping. Ada sealed food in mason jars. She brought blankets, tools, oil for the lamps, matches dipped in wax to keep them dry. "This is not a hiding place," Ada wrote in the journal. "This is a home for people who have nowhere else." Harold looked at the table he was leaning on, the dovetailed joints, the smooth, flat surface. Elias Crane had built this table 80 years ago, carrying wood into a cave and cutting joints by lamplight. Harold ran his thumb along the edge and felt the craftsmanship in every inch. "He was good," Harold said quietly. June looked up from the journal. "Who?" "Elias. The man who built this table. He knew what he was doing." June smiled, small and tired. "Takes one to know one." They slept on the stone ledge that night with the quilts pulled around them. The quilts smelled like cedar and dust, and the fabric was stiff from decades of stillness, but they were warm. Warmer than the highway overpass. Warmer than anything Harold had expected to feel again. In the morning, Harold started working. He couldn't help it. His hands saw the problems before his brain caught up. The second shelf on the far wall was pulling away from its anchor. The table had a slight wobble, one leg shorter than the other after decades of the floor settling beneath it. The hearthstones had shifted, leaving a gap where smoke would escape into the room instead of up through the chimney crack. He used what he had, his pocket knife. Flat stones he pried from the cave floor. A piece of wood he split from one of the old supply crates on the shelf. Within an hour, the shelf was secure. By noon, the table sat level. By evening, he'd repacked the hearthstones and tested the draft with a small fire built from dry brush June gathered near the cave entrance. The smoke pulled upward and disappeared through the chimney crack into the open air above. "Well," June said, watching the fire glow, "we have heat." Harold sat beside her and held his hands toward the flames. His knuckles ached, his knee throbbed, but something in his chest had loosened for the first time in months. "Whoever left these mason jars knew what they were doing," June said. She'd opened one carefully and found dried beans inside, sealed in wax, still hard and smooth after all this time. Some of this might still be good. They soaked the beans in water Harold collected from a thin trickle he'd found at the back of the cave, seeping through a crack in the limestone. The water was cold and clean. He caught it in one of the empty jars and tasted it first. The beans took hours to soften over the small fire, but when they were finally ready, it was the best meal either of them had eaten in days. June added a pinch of salt from a sealed tin she'd found on the shelf. They ate from the same jar with a wooden spoon Ada had probably carved herself. "Tomorrow I'm going to look deeper," Harold said. "The cave goes further back. I could feel air moving from that direction." "Be careful," June said. "I'm always careful." "Harold, I'll be careful." The next morning, Harold took the lamp and followed the passage at the back of the chamber. The ceiling dropped low and he had to duck, but the floor was solid and the air stayed clean. After about 20 feet, the passage widened into a second room, smaller than the first, maybe 10 feet across. He lifted the lamp and looked around. Shelves lined the walls here too, but these held different things. Glass jars filled with seeds, their lids sealed tight with wax. A cast iron skillet wrapped in oilcloth. A set of hand tools, a hammer, a saw, a hand drill, all oiled and stored with care. Folded canvas tarps, rope coiled neatly on a wooden peg, a kerosene lantern with fuel still in the reservoir, a root cellar, a second layer of preparation. Ada hadn't just built a shelter, she'd built a supply depot. Harold picked up the hammer. The handle was hickory, the head forged iron, and the balance was perfect. He gripped it and felt the weight settle into his palm the way a good tool does, familiar and ready. He brought everything back to the main chamber and laid it out on the table for June to see. "Seeds," June said, holding a jar up to the lamplight. "Squash, maybe. And these could be pole beans." She opened another. Turnips. Harold, these might still germinate. 80 years old? Seeds can last a century in the right conditions. Cool, dry, sealed. This cave is perfect for storage. She held the jar close. Ada knew that. That afternoon, while June read more of the journal and Harold reinforced the passage entrance with flat stones to keep animals out, they heard something, a low whine, coming from outside the cave. Harold squeezed through the narrow entrance and found a dog sitting about 10 feet from the opening. A blue heeler mix, maybe 40 pounds, ribs showing through a coat matted with burrs and dried mud. One ear stood straight up, the other folded at the tip. The dog watched Harold with pale eyes but didn't move. "Hey there," Harold said. The dog didn't come closer, didn't run either, just sat and watched. Harold went back inside and came out with a handful of the beans they'd cooked the night before. He set them on a flat rock near the cave entrance and backed away. The dog approached slowly, sniffed the rock, and ate every bean. Then he sat down again and looked at Harold. "All right," Harold said. "Suit yourself." He went back inside. An hour later, when he came out for water, the dog was still there. By the third day, the dog had moved closer. He sat just outside the entrance, watching whoever came and went. June brought him water in a jar lid. She sat on the ground about 5 feet away and talked to him in the same calm voice she'd used on scared third graders for 3 decades. "You've had a rough time," she said. "I can see that. So have we. So maybe we understand each other." The dog's tail moved once, just a twitch like he was testing whether it still worked. On the 4th morning, June woke up and the dog was inside the cave, curled at the foot of the stone ledge where they slept. His eyes were open, watching her. "Harold," she said. Harold looked. Came in on his own. He needs a name. Harold studied the dog. Pale eyes, thin body, quiet as smoke, showed up out of nowhere, like a ghost. He shrugged. Ghost, then. Ghost stayed. He stayed close to June during the day, following her when she went out to gather wood or wash clothes in the stream about a quarter-mile down the slope. At night, he slept between them, his warm body filling a space they didn't know was empty until it wasn't. The days took on a rhythm. Harold worked. He used the tools from the root cellar to reinforce the cave walls, build a proper sleeping platform, and carve a set of pegs for hanging clothes and the lamp. June organized the supplies, cataloged what they had, and kept reading Ada's journal, a few pages each evening by firelight. The journal was more than a record. It was a portrait of a woman who refused to be destroyed by what had been done to her. Ada wrote about the families she helped. She wrote about the children learning to read by lamplight. She wrote about Elias teaching the boys how to lay stone and split wood. She wrote about arguments and fear and cold nights when everyone huddled together and wondered if the world outside would ever let them back in. And she wrote about hope. "The mining company thinks they won," Ada wrote in November of '44. "They have our land, they have our homes, but they do not have us. They do not have what we carry inside, and I will make certain they never get this mountain." 10 days after Harold and June had crawled into the cave, a man named Curtis Boone found them. Curtis was 62, a hunter who lived alone in a cabin about 3 miles south. He knew these ridges better than anyone in the county. He'd been tracking a buck along the upper slope when he smelled smoke, not wildfire smoke, which was sharp and spreading. This was wood smoke contained, coming from a place where no one should be burning anything. He followed it to a thin wisp rising from a crack in the rock about 50 feet above the cave entrance. He worked his way down the slope and found the narrow opening in the limestone. Rhododendron branches had been cleared away from it recently. Boot prints in the mud outside. Curtis pulled his rifle off his shoulder and called into the dark. "Hello in there. Anybody home?" A pause. Then a man's voice, calm and steady. "We're here. My wife and I, we're not looking for trouble." "Neither am I," Curtis said. "I'm looking for a deer. Mind if I come in?" "It's tight," the voice said. "Watch your shoulders." Curtis set his rifle outside, turned on his headlamp, and crawled through. When he stood up in the chamber and saw what was in front of him, he stopped and stared. An elderly couple, clean but thin, sitting at a hand-built table in a limestone room lit by oil lamps, shelves of mason jars, a stone hearth with a fire burning clean, a blue heeler sleeping on a ledge covered with quilts. The whole setup looked like something from another century. "Name's Curtis Boone," he said. "I live down the mountain." "Harold Whitfield. This is my wife, June." "Ma'am." Curtis nodded to June. Then he looked around the chamber again. How long have you two been in here? About 10 days, Harold said. 10 days in a cave. It's warmer than it looks. Curtis pulled off his cap and scratched the back of his head. He was a big man, broad shoulders, gray beard, hands like shovels. He looked at the fire, the organized shelves, the repaired furniture. Then he looked at Harold. You do all this work yourself. The original builder did most of it. I just fixed what needed fixing. Curtis sat down on a flat stone near the hearth. Ghost lifted his head, studied the newcomer, and put his head back down. Mr. Whitfield, Harold, I don't know your story, and you don't owe me your story. But I've lived on this mountain my whole life, and I've never seen two people make a cave look this much like a home. He paused. Do you need help? Harold's jaw tightened. The word help hit him somewhere deep. He'd spent his whole life on the giving end of that word. June spoke before Harold could say no. We could use some firewood, and if you have any food you could spare, we'd be grateful. Harold looked at her. She looked back. Her eyes said, Let someone help us, Harold. Just this once. Curtis nodded. I'll be back tomorrow morning. Firewood and whatever I've got in the pantry. He was as good as his word. The next day, he came back with an armload of split oak, 4 cans of soup, a bag of rice, a jug of water, and a box of kitchen matches. The day after that, he brought batteries, a propane camp stove, and a wool hat for June. Cedar Hollow's about 7 miles west of here, Curtis said on his third visit, warming his hands by the fire while June heated soup on the camp stove. Small town. Used to be a mining community. Most of the mines closed in the 70s. Half the shops are boarded up now, but the people who stayed are good people. We'll manage on our own, Harold said. Curtis looked at him evenly. I believe you will, but managing and living aren't the same thing. He took a sip of coffee June had made from a packet in his supplies. Then he said something that made June set down the journal she'd been holding. You know, this mountain has a history. Back during the war, there was a woman who lived up here. Local legend. Name was Crane. Ada Crane. Folks around Cedar Hollow still talk about her. She took in families when the mining company drove them off their land. Hid them, fed them, kept them going until they could get on their feet. They say she had some kind of shelter up in the rocks, but nobody ever found it. Curtis looked around the chamber. I think maybe you too did. June's hands went still on the journal's leather cover. She looked at Harold. Harold looked at her. Curtis, June said carefully. My maiden name is Crane. Curtis set his coffee down. Say that again. My mother was Mary Crane. She was born in these mountains, but she left when she was young. She never talked about it. Not once. And all the time I knew her. Curtis looked at the journal in June's hands, then at the shelves, the hearth, the walls Elias had shaped. Your mother was Ada Crane's daughter. I think so. June's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. Ada writes about a daughter named Mary, born in 46. That's the year my mother was born. Harold sat very still. He'd been married to June for over half a century, and in all that time she'd mentioned her mother's family maybe a dozen times. Mary Crane Whitfield had been a private woman who kept her past locked in a room no one was allowed to enter. She'd raised June in a small apartment in Morgantown, worked as a secretary at a law office, gone to church on Sundays, and died of pneumonia at 68 without ever explaining where she came from or why she left. Mom used to get quiet around October, June said, more to herself than to either man. Every autumn, she'd sit by the window and stare at the mountains. I asked her once what she was looking at, and she said, just remembering. That's all she ever gave me. Curtis leaned forward. The Cranes were real people around here. Old family. Been on this land longer than most. When the mining company came through, Ada was the one who fought back. Everyone else sold or got pushed out. Ada dug in. He paused. The story goes that after Elias died, Ada raised Mary alone. Then Mary left, and Ada stayed up here by herself. Nobody saw much of her after that. She passed sometime in the late 60s, I think. My father mentioned her once or twice. June opened the journal to the entries she hadn't reached yet. Harold moved the lamp closer so she could read. March the 12th, 1946, June read. Mary was born last night. Elias held her first. He cried. I have never seen my husband cry, not when they took the land, not when the mine shaft collapsed on his leg. But he held our daughter and he wept. She has his hands. June stopped reading. Her own hands trembled on the page. Harold put his arm around her shoulders. "Keep going," he said gently. "She's talking to you." The later entries were sparser. Elias got sick. The mines had done something to his lungs. By 1947, he couldn't walk to the cave anymore. Ada ran the refuge alone, carrying supplies up the mountain by herself, checking on the families who still sheltered there during hard winters. Mary grew up between the farm and the cave, climbing the ridge barefoot, eating berries off the bushes, learning to read from the same books Ada had used to teach the other children. But Mary hated the mountain. That was clear in Ada's writing, a pain Ada carried without complaint. "Mary asks every day when we're leaving," Ada wrote in 1958. "She says there's nothing here. I tell her everything is here. She doesn't understand. Maybe I'm the one who doesn't understand." In 1964, Mary turned 18 and left. "She went in the night," Ada wrote, left a note on the kitchen table. It said, "I'm sorry, Mama. I can't stay." I read it 7 times. Then I put it in the Bible and have not opened it since. June closed the journal. She pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. "My mother left this woman alone on a mountain," June said quietly, "and she never went back. People leave for all kinds of reasons," Curtis said. "Doesn't mean they stop caring." "She never told me," June said. "She never told me about any of this. Not Ada, not Elias, not the cave, not the families. She just erased it. Like none of it happened. Harold took her hand. Maybe she couldn't talk about it without going back, and maybe going back was the one thing she couldn't do." June held the journal tight. Her jaw worked. Then she set it on the table and looked at Curtis. "What else do you know about Ada Crane?" Curtis stayed for another hour, telling them what little he'd heard over the decades. Ada had lived alone after Mary left. She kept the farm going for a while, selling vegetables at the market in town, mending clothes for neighbors. People respected her. Nobody pitied her because Ada wouldn't have allowed it. She died sometime around 1960, 9 or 70. A neighbor found her in the rocking chair on her porch, eyes closed, hands folded. There was no funeral that Curtis knew of. The farm fell into ruin. The land was tangled in some kind of legal dispute with the mining company, and nobody ever sorted it out. "That's all I know," Curtis said, "but I can ask around town. Some of the older folks might remember more." He stood up to leave, then turned back. "One more thing. You two need anything from town. Anything at all, you tell me." Harold asked. It came out sharper than he meant. Curtis looked at him for a long moment. "Because Ada helped people who had nowhere to go, and you're her granddaughter-in-law sitting in her cave. That means something around here." After Curtis left, Harold and June sat in the quiet of the chamber. Ghost was curled by the fire, his coat filling out slightly from regular meals. The October cold had deepened outside, but inside the cave the air held at a steady temperature, cool but not bitter. "Harold," June said. "Yeah, this is my grandmother's cave." Harold nodded. "It is. She built all this for people who had nothing. And 80 years later, we crawled in here with nothing." June looked at the shelves, the hearth, the quilts. She was waiting for us. She just didn't know it would be us. The next week changed everything. Curtis didn't just bring supplies. He brought people. Quietly, carefully. 1 or 2 at a time. He didn't broadcast Harold and June's story, didn't make a spectacle of it. He told a few people he trusted, and those people told a few more, and before long a small, steady stream of visitors found their way to the cave entrance with things to give. A woman from town brought a box of canned vegetables and a heavy coat for June. A young man carried up a proper lantern and a 5-gallon jug of drinking water. A retired electrician brought a solar-powered battery pack and 2 LED lights that ran for hours on a single charge. Harold accepted the help. Not easily, not without June's gentle insistence, but he accepted it. And then he started giving back. The woman who brought the vegetables mentioned her porch railing was loose. Harold walked the 7 miles to town the next day with Elias Crane's tools and a canvas sack over his shoulder, and fixed it in an hour. The young man said his mother's kitchen cabinets were falling apart. Harold rebuilt the worst 2 over an afternoon. Using wood the young man drove him to the hardware store to buy. Word spread, not about the cave, but about the old carpenter who showed up with hand tools and fixed things for free. People started asking for Harold by name. "That's Harold Whitfield," they'd say. "Lives up on the ridge. He'll fix just about anything if you give him a cup of coffee and a place to sit down." June found her own way. She met a teenage girl at the general store who was failing her senior English class. The girl's mother worked double shifts and couldn't help. June offered to tutor her 3 afternoons a week. The girl hiked halfway up the ridge, and June met her at a flat rock near the stream where they could sit and work through essays and grammar. "You're a teacher," the girl said one afternoon. "I was," June said. "You still are." The girl passed her midterm with the highest grade she'd ever gotten. Her mother sent a jar of homemade apple butter up the mountain with Curtis, and June set it on the shelf next to Ada's mason jars. New things beside old things. The cave was filling up with both. If you've made it this far into Harold and June's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. It was early November when June reached the last pages of Ada's journal. She'd been reading slowly, a few entries each night, making it last. But now she was near the end, and Ada's handwriting had changed. The letters were thinner, shakier. The entries were shorter. December the 2nd, 1946, June read aloud. "Elias coughs blood now. He says it's nothing. I know better. The mine took his lungs. It will take the rest of him before long." Then a later entry, undated. "I have gathered everything. The deed to our land, the papers the mining company filed, the letter from Mr. Patterson, the lawyer in Elkins, who told me in '46 that the transfer was never legal. The company forged the signatures. Our land was stolen, not sold. I put everything in the lockbox Elias made, the one with the iron hinges. I sealed it behind the hearthstone. If my blood ever finds this place, they will know what was taken from us. They will have proof." June read the passage twice. Then she looked at the hearth. Harold. He was already on his feet. They knelt together in front of the stone hearth. The fire had burned down to embers. Harold studied the stonework, running his fingers along the joints the way he'd run them along 100 walls and foundations over the decades. Feeling for the one that wasn't quite right, he found it. The third stone from the left on the bottom row. It was the same size as the others, the same color, but it sat a fraction of an inch forward, held in place by mortar that was slightly different from the rest. Harold took his pocket knife and worked the mortar loose. It crumbled like dry sand. He gripped the stone and pulled. It slid out with a grinding sound that echoed off the cave walls. Behind it was a cavity in the rock about a foot deep. Inside sat a metal box roughly the size of a bread loaf, iron with brass hinges. A simple latch held it closed. Harold lifted it out. It was heavy. He set it on the table and looked at June. She opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the moisture out for 8 decades, were 4 items. The first was a folded document, thick paper with a county seal in the corner. A land deed dated 1914 recording the transfer of 200 acres on the eastern slope of the ridge to Elias James Crane and his heirs in perpetuity. The property description matched the mountain they were sitting inside. The second was another document, this one from the Ridley Mining Company, a transfer of ownership dated September of '44. 2 signatures at the bottom, allegedly Elias and Ada Crane. June held it up to the lamp. Even she could see the signatures were different from Ada's careful handwriting in the journal. Sloppy, rushed, forged. The third item was a letter on legal stationery from a lawyer named Walter Patterson, dated March of 1946. The letter confirmed what Ada had written in the journal. The land transfer was fraudulent. The Crane family deed had never been legally voided. Patterson recommended filing suit, but noted that the mining company had the money to bury the case in court for decades. The fourth item was Ada's will, 2 pages, handwritten, witnessed by 2 names neither Harold nor June recognized. The will was simple. Everything Ada owned, the land, the cave, whatever remained of the farm, was left to my blood, whoever finds this place when they need it most. June held the will in both hands. Her grandmother had written these words at a table in a cave, knowing she might never meet the person who read them. Knowing her own daughter had walked away. Knowing the mining company thought they'd won. And still, Ada had believed someone would come. Harold put his hand on June's shoulder. His own hands were trembling. "June," he said quietly, "this deed was never legally transferred. The mining company dissolved in the '70s. Curtis said nobody ever sorted out the land." June looked at him. "This mountain," Harold said, 200 acres. Your family never lost it, not legally. The company stole it with forged papers, and then the company disappeared. He tapped the deed. This is still valid. This land is yours." June stared at the deed, at Ada's will, at the forged signatures and the lawyer's letter, 80 years of injustice, sealed in an iron box behind a hearthstone, waiting for someone who needed it. She thought about her mother, Mary Crane, who had run from this mountain at 18 and never looked back. She thought about Ada, who had stayed and fought and built a refuge with her bare hands. She thought about Bradford and Linda, who had turned their parents out with blankets and a phone number. And she thought about the fact that she was sitting in the exact spot where her grandmother had once sheltered families who had lost everything. History had circled back. The mountain had brought her home. Ghost lifted his head and rested his chin on June's knee. She stroked his ear and looked at Harold. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We take these to a lawyer," Harold said, "and we find out if Ada's fight is finally over." Curtis knew a retired lawyer in town. The man had practiced property law for 3 decades before his wife got sick, and he closed the office to take care of her. He still had his books, his knowledge, and a sharp mind. Curtis drove Harold down the mountain on a Thursday morning, the lockbox sitting between them on the bench seat of Curtis's truck. The lawyer's house was a small brick building on the edge of town, with a porch that needed paint and a garden that had been tended with real care. He met them at the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses, looked at the lockbox, and said, "Let's see what you've got." They sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours. The lawyer spread the documents out and examined each one, holding the land deed up to the window light, comparing Ada's handwriting in the journal to the signatures on the mining company's transfer. He read the Patterson letter twice, took notes on a legal pad, and made 3 phone calls to the county recorder's office. When he was done, he took off his glasses and looked at Harold. "Here's what I can tell you. The original deed is legitimate. Recorded in 1914, Elias James Crane, 200 acres on the eastern slope of the ridge, heirs in perpetuity. The mining company's transfer document has problems. The signatures don't match any authenticated samples I can find, and the Patterson letter from 46 confirms they were forged. The Ridley Mining Company dissolved in 1971. When a company dissolves, any land it holds reverts either to its creditors or to the state, depending on the dissolution terms. But here's the key. The Ridley Mining Company never actually held this land. They filed a fraudulent transfer. The deed in the county records still shows the Crane family as legal owners. So the land is June's, Harold said. It's not that simple, but it's close. June would need to file a quiet title action to clear the record. She'd need to prove she's Ada Crane's direct descendant, which shouldn't be hard with birth certificates and the will. The fact that no one has claimed or contested the property in over 50 years works heavily in her favor. I've seen cases like this resolved in a matter of months. How much would that cost? Harold asked. The lawyer smiled slightly. For the couple living in Ada Crane's cave, not a penny. I've been bored since Margaret passed. Consider this pro bono. Curtis drove Harold back up the mountain that afternoon. Neither of them said much. When they reached the cave, Harold told June everything the lawyer had said. She listened with her hands folded on the table, Ghost's head resting on her foot. 200 acres, she said. 200 acres. And he thinks it's real. He thinks we can prove it. He does. June was quiet for a long moment. Ada hid those documents because she knew she couldn't win the fight in her lifetime. She didn't have the money. She didn't have the connections. But she saved the evidence anyway, because she believed someone would come along who could finish what she started. She looked at Harold. 80 years. She waited 80 years for this. The lawyer filed the paperwork the following week. Harold and June expected the process to be quiet. A few forms submitted to the county, a waiting period, maybe a hearing, but small towns are poor keepers of secrets. A clerk at the recorder's office told her husband. Her husband mentioned it to a friend at the hardware store. The friend told a reporter at the regional newspaper who'd been looking for a story that wasn't about budget cuts or road repairs. The reporter drove to Cedar Hollow on a Monday. Curtis tried to keep her away from the cave, but the reporter was persistent, and June, after some hesitation, agreed to talk. She sat on a flat rock near the cave entrance with Ghost beside her and told the reporter everything. The house, the children, the blankets, the 2 days walking, the cave, the journal, the lockbox. The story ran in the Wednesday edition. Elderly couple finds 80-year-old secret in mountain cave. By Friday, it had been picked up by 3 larger papers and 2 television stations. Harold hated the attention. He sat in the cave and refused to come out when a camera crew from the state capitol showed up at the ridge. June handled the attention better. She was a retired teacher, she knew how to talk to people, but she kept the cave off limits. Nobody got inside. That's not mine to show. She told the reporter on a follow-up call. That belongs to Ada. The phone call started the following week. Curtis had given Harold and June a prepaid cell phone weeks earlier for emergencies. It rang on a Tuesday afternoon. Harold looked at the screen. The number was Bradford's. He answered, "Dad." Bradford's voice was careful, measured, the voice he used in business meetings. "I saw the article." "Which one?" "The one about the cave and the land." Silence. "Dad, we need to talk about this. If that property claim is real, we're talking about significant acreage. Mountain land in West Virginia. You could develop it, sell timber rights, lease it for recreation. I can get an appraiser out there this week." Harold listened. He listened to his son talk about acreage and timber rights and appraisers. He listened to Bradford use the word "we," as if the last 6 months hadn't happened. He listened until Bradford paused for breath. "You sold our house," Harold said. "Dad, that's a separate issue. You sold our house and gave us blankets. Your mother slept under a highway overpass. I didn't know you were going to do that. I gave you the shelter information. You gave us a phone number. Your mother's hip went out on the second day. She couldn't walk. We crawled into a cave because we had nowhere else to go. Dad, I'm trying to help now. Don't come here, Bradford." Harold hung up. His hands were steady. The rage he'd expected wasn't there, just a flatness, like a field after a long rain. Bradford came anyway. He drove up on a Saturday morning in his leased SUV, the tires slipping on the gravel track Curtis had worn into the mountainside. Linda was in the passenger seat. It was the first time Harold had seen his daughter in over a year. Bradford parked near the cave entrance and got out. He was wearing dress shoes. They sank into the mud immediately. He looked at the rhododendron, the narrow crack in the rock face, the smoke rising from the chimney vent above. "This is where you've been living," he said. Harold stood outside the cave entrance with Ghost at his side. Curtis was there too, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed. 3 people from town who'd come to drop off supplies that morning stood nearby. "This is where we've been living," Harold said. Linda got out of the car slowly. She looked thinner than Harold remembered. She looked at the cave, the dog, the neighbors, her parents. She didn't speak. Bradford walked toward the cave entrance. "Can I see inside?" "No," Harold said. "Dad, come on. I'm not the enemy here." "You're not the enemy," Harold said. "You're the reason we're here." Bradford's jaw clenched. "I made a mistake. I admit that. The house situation got out of hand. But I'm here now and I want to help. If this land claim is real, you're going to need someone who understands development, financing, legal strategy. I can bring in the right people." "You brought in the right people when you sold our house," Harold said. "A real estate agent and a lawyer. Both for you, none for us. That's not fair?" "Bradford." June's voice came from behind Harold. She'd stepped out of the cave and stood in the entrance, one hand on the rock wall. She looked small against the stone, but her voice carried. Bradford turned to her. "Mom." June walked forward until she was standing in front of her son. She looked up at him. Bradford was a head taller, broader, younger by nearly 30 years. But June held his gaze without blinking. "You gave us blankets and pointed at the door," she said. "Your father built porches for half the county. I taught children to read for 3 decades. We raised you and your sister in that house. We fed you, clothed you, sat with you when you were sick, drove you to school, helped you with homework, paid for your college, and when we got old, when we needed you, you sold our home and handed us a phone number. Mom, I was trying to do what was best. You were trying to do what was easy." "There's a difference." Bradford opened his mouth. June kept talking. "This cave was built by my grandmother, a woman I never met because my mother was too ashamed to come back here. Ada Crane lost everything to a mining company that forged her name on a piece of paper. She lost her land, her husband, and then her daughter. And she still spent the rest of her life helping other people. She built a shelter in a mountain for strangers." June's voice didn't waver. "You couldn't even build a shelter for your own parents." Bradford stood very still. The color had drained from his face. "Now you come here because you read about the land. You come here talking about development and appraisers and timber rights. You don't ask how your father's knee is doing. You don't ask about my hip. You don't ask if we're warm or fed or alive. June stepped closer. What kind of son are you, Bradford? The question hung in the air. Nobody moved. Ghost pressed against June's leg. Curtis uncrossed his arms but stayed where he was. The neighbors watched in silence. Bradford's lips moved, but nothing came out. Your parents have done more for this town in 2 months than you've done for them in 20, Curtis said from beside his truck. He said it plainly without heat. Linda was leaning against the car, her arms wrapped around herself. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't make a sound. I think you should go. June said to Bradford, Mom, please, go home. Think about why you came here. If the answer is the land, don't come back. If it's something else, you know where to find us. Bradford stood for another moment. Then he turned and walked back to the car. His dress shoes were covered in mud. He opened the driver's door and sat inside without looking at anyone. Linda didn't move immediately. She stood at the passenger door and looked at her parents, at Harold, who was watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, something between grief and patience, at June, who was standing straight despite the hip that must have been screaming, at Ghost, who sat between them with his pale eyes steady. Linda lifted her hand slightly, barely a wave. More of an acknowledgement than she got in the car. The SUV backed down the mountain trail, tires spinning on loose gravel, and disappeared through the trees. Harold let out a long breath. June leaned against him and he felt the effort it had cost her. She was shaking again. You all right? He asked. No, she said, but I needed to say it. You said it. I've been holding that for a long time. Harold put his arm around her. I know. The neighbors drifted away quietly, giving them space. Curtis walked over and put a hand on Harold's shoulder, just for a moment, then went back to his truck and drove down the mountain. That evening, June sat by the fire with Ada's journal open on her lap. Ghost was curled beside her, and Harold was working on a shelf bracket at the table, carving a notch with his pocket knife. The rhythm of the blade was the only sound besides the fire. Harold, June said. He looked up. Listen to this. It's the last entry Ada ever wrote. There's no date. She held the journal close to the firelight and read, I have lived on this mountain for most of my life. I came here as a bride, and I will die here alone. My husband is in the ground. My daughter is in the world. The families I sheltered have scattered to places I will never see, and still I believe what I have always believed. You build for the people who come after, not for yourself, for them. This cave is not mine. It belongs to whoever needs it most. I built it so someone would find it when the world turned them out. I built it because that is all I know how to do. June closed the journal. She built it for us, she said. Harold set down his knife. She built it for everyone. We just got here first. No, June said. We got here last. And that's exactly when she wanted us to come. Outside the cave, the mountain was dark and quiet. November had settled in, sharp-edged and cold, but inside the chamber, the fire burned steady. The quilts were warm. Ghost sighed in his sleep. June put the journal on the shelf where she'd first found it and went to sit beside Harold at the table. He reached for her hand and she gave it. I want to do something with this land, June said, something Ada would be proud of. I know, Harold said. I've been thinking the same thing. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in early February, Harold Whitfield drove the last nail into the porch railing of the cabin he had built with his own hands. It wasn't large. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a covered porch facing east toward the valley. Pine framing, cedar siding, a metal roof that Curtis had salvaged from a barn demolition in the next county. The windows came from a schoolhouse being torn down in Elkins. The front door was oak cut and planed from a tree that fell during a January ice storm on the ridge. Harold had designed it on a piece of paper at the cave table, sketching by lamplight while June read beside him. He'd drawn the floor plan, calculated the materials, and figured out how to build it with a crew of volunteers who showed up every weekend carrying whatever they could spare. Curtis organized the workdays. A retired contractor from town supervised the foundation. 3 young men Harold had been teaching to frame carried the ridge beam up the mountain on their shoulders. The woman whose porch Harold had fixed brought lunch every Saturday. By late January, the cabin had walls, a roof, and a wood stove that drew clean. It sat about 30 yards from the cave entrance, on a flat shelf of land that looked out over the valley. From the porch, you could see the town below, the old mining road winding through the trees, and on clear mornings the next ridge shimmering blue in the distance. The cave was still there, still exactly as Ada had left it. Harold and June kept it sealed and maintained. The journal sat on its shelf. The mason jars stood in their rows. The hearth was cold now because they had a real stove in the cabin, but the quilts were still folded on the ledge, and the table still held its level. Some things you don't change. You just build around them. The legal process had taken less time than the lawyer expected. June provided her mother's birth certificate, which listed Cedar Hollow as the place of birth and Mary Crane as the name. The lawyer traced the lineage from Ada to Mary to June with records from the county vital statistics office. The quiet title action was filed in December. Nobody contested it. The mining company had been gone for over 50 years. The state had no record of acquiring the land. The county had been collecting nominal taxes on a parcel that was technically still owned by the Crane estate. In January, a judge signed the order. The deed was clear. 200 acres on the eastern slope of the ridge, including the mountain, the cave, the old Crane farm site, and the valley below belonged to June Whitfield, born June Crane, granddaughter of Ada and Elias. June held the new deed in her hands and sat with it for a long time. She didn't celebrate. She didn't cry. She didn't cry. She held it the way she'd held Ada's journal that first night, with quiet amazement and a respect that went deeper than happiness. "What do you want to do with it?" Harold asked. "Exactly what Ada did," June said. "Give people a place." They set up a community land trust. The lawyer handled the paperwork. Still pro bono, though June insisted on baking him a pie every week until he told her his pantry couldn't hold any more. The trust opened the valley to families who needed space to grow food. Harold laid out garden plots on the flattest acre, marking rows with stakes and string. By mid-February, the first families had started clearing their patches, turning the soil with borrowed tools, planning what they'd plant when the ground thawed. Harold built a gathering hall next. It was his biggest project, a simple post and beam structure on the north side of the cabin, open on one end with a roof that would keep rain off. It could hold about 30 people. He framed it in a week with help from the young men he'd been training. They were getting better. One of them had started calling himself a carpenter, and Harold didn't correct him. June started a reading circle at the hall, Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Anyone who wanted to come could bring something to read aloud. A few teenagers showed up at first, then their parents, then neighbors who'd never read anything out loud in their lives. The teenager June had been tutoring read a poem she'd written herself. The room went quiet when she finished. "That's good," June said. "Read another." Ghost had gained weight. His coat was thick and clean, and his eyes had lost the wariness they'd carried when he first appeared at the cave entrance. He followed June everywhere during the day and slept on the cabin porch at night, one ear up, listening. When strangers came up the mountain for the first time, Ghost met them at the trailhead and walked them in. People started calling him the greeter. "That dog knows who's welcome before I do," Curtis said one morning, watching Ghost escort a family with 2 children up the path. "He just pays attention," June said. "Most people don't." The news coverage faded after a few weeks, replaced by other stories. The reporter called once more for a follow-up, and June gave her a brief update. The land was theirs. They were building. The community was growing. The reporter asked if the children had come back. "Not yet," June said. "That changed in late February. Linda arrived on a Thursday morning without calling ahead. She drove a sedan, not Bradford's SUV. She parked at the bottom of the trail and walked up, carrying nothing but a small bag. Harold saw her first from the cabin porch. He watched her climb the path, stopping twice to catch her breath. She'd lost more weight. Her face looked drawn. But she was there, on the mountain, in hiking boots instead of office shoes. "June," Harold said through the cabin door. "Linda's here." June came out and stood beside him. They watched their daughter approach. Ghost walked out to meet her, sniffed her hand, and fell into step beside her. When Linda reached the porch, she looked at her parents, at the cabin, at the valley below. She didn't speak for a moment, then she said, "I was wondering if you needed help with anything." June studied her daughter's face, looked for the agenda, the angle, didn't find one. "The gathering hall could use a coat of paint," June said. "I can do that," Linda said. She stayed that day and painted the hall's eastern wall. She didn't talk much. Harold brought her lunch, a bowl of soup and bread from the kitchen. She ate on the hall floor with her legs crossed and paint on her hands. "Thank you," she said when he took the bowl. "You're welcome." The next morning, Linda was still there. She'd slept in the cabin's second room, on a cot Curtis had brought up weeks earlier for when guests stayed late. She was up before Harold, sitting on the porch in the cold, watching the sunrise over the valley. "Coffee's on," Harold said from the doorway. She came inside. They sat at the kitchen table, Harold and June and Linda drinking coffee and not saying anything that mattered. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the sound of people who weren't ready to talk about the big things but were willing to sit in the same room. Linda painted the rest of the hall that day. She fixed a fence post that had gone crooked. She carried water from the stream and stacked firewood on the porch. She worked steadily and asked for nothing. On the third morning, she found June in the cave. June was sitting at Ada's table with the journal open, the way she sometimes did when she needed to think. Linda had crawled through the passage on her hands and knees, and when she stood up in the chamber, her eyes went wide. "Mom," she said, looking around. "This is real. This is real." Linda walked the room slowly. She touched the shelves, the mason jars, the quilts. She looked at the hearth where the lockbox had been hidden. She stood in front of Ada's journal and read the first page over June's shoulder. She was strong, Linda said. She had to be, June said. Nobody else was going to do it for her. Linda was quiet for a while. Then she sat down across from June at the table, the same spot where Harold usually sat. "Mom, I know sorry isn't enough." "It's not," June said, "but it's a start. I should have come. When Bradford was selling the house, I should have fought him. I should have been there. You should have him. I was scared of him. I've always been scared of him. He's so sure about everything, and I was so busy pretending my life was fine that I couldn't look at what was happening to yours." June reached across the table and put her hand over Linda's. "You're here now, is that enough? I don't know yet, but you're here. That counts." Linda stayed a week, then 2. She called her office and took a leave of absence. She slept in the cabin, ate meals with her parents, worked on whatever needed doing. She and June didn't have the conversation, the one that would crack everything open, but they were moving toward it slowly, one shared task at a time. In March, an envelope arrived at the cabin. Curtis brought it up with the weekly mail run. It was addressed to Harold and June Whitfield. No return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $25,000. No note. Harold looked at the check. He knew Bradford's handwriting from the envelope. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at it for 5 minutes. Then he put the check back in the envelope, wrote 3 words on a piece of paper, tucked it inside, and sealed it up. "What did you write?" June asked. "Come yourself," Harold said. He gave the envelope to Curtis to mail. Spring came early that year. By the second week of March, the first green was showing on the valley floor. The garden plots were planted. Peas and lettuce were already pushing through the soil. Harold's Gathering Hall hosted its first community dinner. 22 people sitting at long tables he'd built from pine boards, eating food they'd grown or cooked or brought from home. June stood at the head of the table and looked at the faces around her. The teenager she'd tutored, the woman whose porch Harold fixed, Curtis, who had found them in a cave and decided they mattered. 3 families who'd planted gardens on Crane land. Linda sitting between her parents, her sleeves still rolled up from washing dishes. "I want to say something," June said. The room went quiet. "My grandmother built a cave in this mountain to shelter people who had lost everything. She did it because she believed that what you build for others is the only thing that lasts. I never met her. My mother never told me about her, but I found her anyway." June looked at the journal, which sat on a shelf Harold had built into the hall's west wall. Ada Crane wrote that this place belongs to whoever needs it most. That's what this land is for. A place for people who need one. She sat down. Nobody clapped or cheered. They didn't need to. The room was warm. The food was good. The people were present. After dinner, Harold and June walked back to the cabin while the others cleaned up. The evening was mild. Ghost trotted ahead of them, his tail up, nose working the breeze. The valley below was turning from brown to green, fields and hillsides waking up after the long winter. They sat on the porch the way they'd sat on the porch of their old house for 4 decades. Harold in the chair on the left, June on the right, close enough to touch but not always touching. It was the same rhythm they'd always had. The difference was the view. And the fact that nobody could take this from them. Harold, June said. Do you think Bradford will come? Harold thought about his son. Thought about the check, the dress shoes in the mud, the measured voice on the phone. Thought about the boy who'd sat at the kitchen table every morning for 18 years, who'd once asked Harold to teach him how to use a hammer, who'd held his mother's hand at church on Sundays. I think he will, Harold said. It'll just take him longer to get here than it should. Like his grandmother Mary, June said. Running from the mountain until the mountain catches up. Harold smiled. First time in a while. Something like that. The light was fading. The ridge above them was a dark line against the sky. The cave entrance was invisible from here, hidden behind its rhododendron screen, holding its silence. Down in the valley, a light came on in one of the new garden sheds. Harold, we're home. He reached for her hand. She gave it. Ghost settled between their chairs and rested his chin on his paws. His pale eyes watched the valley as the last light dimmed and the first stars came through. The mountain didn't care what they'd lost. It cared what they did next, and what they'd done was exactly what Ada Crane had believed someone would do. They'd taken a place meant for people with nothing and turned it into a place that had everything that mattered. June opened Ada's journal to the first page and read the words one more time, quietly, to herself. This place is for whoever needs it most. She closed the journal and held it against her chest. The stars sharpened. The valley went dark and soft below them. Somewhere down the ridge, the stream that fed the garden plots ran steady over stone. Ghost sighed in his sleep. Harold's hand was warm in hers. And for the first time since the day their son had taken the roof from over their heads, Harold and June Whitfield were at peace. Not the peace of forgetting. The peace of having built something that couldn't be taken away.